Follow along, Catholic pilgrims, as we follow French doctor of the Church, St. Francis de Sales, through his book, Introduction to the Devout Life. Tune in as we read through this practical guide for living out the Catholic faith well. Fellow pilgrims, it's time for another reading. Something I wanted to note last time but forgot is that we hit the halfway mark in the book. That is cause for celebration. It's hard to believe we are already halfway through the book, but when you stick with things and you show up, even in little spurts, you can make it through anything. I've never been what you would call a rich person. Growing up, my parents struggled to get by, but they did the things that needed to happen in order to advance their placement in this world. So I grew up with not much, and I've never been rich. I do feel rich in that I have my health, my faith, my family, friends, and all my needs and wants are met. I've never desired a fancy car or a huge house. I do like money for traveling, if I'm being honest. There was one time in my life where I did feel monetarily rich, and that's when I lived in Turkey. How did my husband and I handle that? Well, I'll explain on the other side of St. Francis talking to us about how to preserve real poverty while actually being rich. Let's turn to chapter 15 of the third part. Chapter 15, How to Practice Real Poverty while being actually rich. The painter Parrhasius, by an ingenious invention, represented Athenians as of a fickle, contradictory disposition, at once passionate, unjust, inconstant, covetous, compassionate, merciful, proud, vainglorious, humble, bullying, and cowardly, and all that in one. And I would combine riches and poverty in your heart, a great care and a great contempt for things temporal. You should be much more watchful than men of the world are, in order to turn your possessions to good use. Are not the gardeners of kings and princes more particular and diligent in the cultivation and embellishment of the gardens committed to their charge than they would be were these their own, and that because they belong to those kings and princes whom they would fain please by their assiduous services? Our possessions are not our own. God has given them to us that we may cultivate them, and it is His will that we should render them useful and fruitful. By our care thereof, we render to Him an acceptable service. And this care must be greater and more real than that which men of the world employ, for they labor only for self-love, but we for the love of God. Now, as self-love is violent, turbulent, and restless, so our cares in its behalf will be troubled, anxious, and uneasy. And as the love of God is gentle, peaceful, and tranquil, so our cares springing from that source, although for worldly goods, will be gentle, mild, and without uneasiness. Let us take such care as this of our possessions, and of their increase on lawful occasions, according to our station. For this service God demands of us, for His love's sake. Take care, however, that you are not deceived by self-love, which sometimes counterfeits the love of God so successfully as to deceive you. To prevent this, and also for fear lest your care for worldly goods should grow into avarice, in addition to what I have said in the preceding chapter, it is well constantly to practice real practical poverty in the midst of the riches and advantages with which God has endowed you. Always dispose of a part of your means by giving freely alms to the poor, for you impoverish yourself by that which you give, and the more it is, the more you are impoverished. Undoubtedly, God will restore it to you in this world as well as in the next, for nothing brings such prosperity as almsgiving. But meanwhile, you will be the poorer for what you give. Oh, the holiness and richness of making oneself poor by almsgiving. Love poverty and the poor, for by this love you will become truly poor yourself, since we become like to that which we love, as says Holy Scripture. Love brings those who share into it an equality. Who is weak, and I am not weak, says St. Paul. He might have continued, "Who is poor? And I am not poor. For love made him like to those he loved. If then you sincerely love the poor, you will truly share their poverty and be poor with them. If you love the poor, go frequently among them, take pleasure in bringing them around you and in visiting and in conversing willingly with them, and mingle with them in the church, the street, and elsewhere. Be poor in speech towards them, speaking with them as their friend, but let your hands be rich, imparting to them freely of your abundance." Would you go still further? Then do not stop at being poor with the poor, but make yourself still poorer than they. The servant is less than his master. Do you become the servant of the poor? Go and tend their sick beds with your own hands. Feed them, serve them, minister to them. Such service is more noble than royalty. How nobly did St. Louis, one of the greatest of monarchs, follow this counsel, frequently helping to serve the poor at the table which he provided for them, and daily causing the poor to share his own table. And many times he ate what remained of their food with an incomparable love. When he visited the hospitals, as was his frequent custom, he generally ministered to those who suffered under the most revolting diseases, those afflicted with leprosy, cancer, and similar diseases, and serving them on his knees and with bared head, acknowledging in their persons the Savior of the world, and cherishing them with the tender love of a mother for her child. St. Elizabeth of Hungary mingled freely amongst the poor, and sometimes wearing a peasant's dress would say to her ladies that were she poor, she would always wear such. Were not these sovereigns poor amidst their riches, and rich in their poverty? Blessed are they who are thus poor, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. To them the King of kings and of poor men will say in the day of judgment, "I was hungry, and you gave me to eat. I was naked, and you covered me. Come, possess you the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." There is no one who is not liable occasionally to suffer some need or inconvenience. A guest arrives whom we would fain receive with honor, and we are unable to do so. The attire we need is not to be had just when we want it. All the wine in our cellar is spoilt, or accidentally when traveling we cannot obtain accommodation such as we are accustomed to. However rich we are, it is easy to find wants, and then as regards our deficiencies, we are poor. You should always hail such little trials gladly, welcome them heartily, and endure them cheerfully. Or if circumstances arise which impoverish you either greatly or in a less degree, such as storms, fires, floods, blight, bad harvests, robbery, or injustice, then is the time to practice poverty, submitting to such losses with meekness, and adapting yourself with patience and resolution to such involuntary poverty. Esau and Jacob both approached their father with hairy hands, but the hair on Jacob's hands was not his own, and could be plucked off without hurting him, whilst that on Esau's hands grew from his natural skin, and whoever endeavored to pull it off would have hurt him. He would have cried out and defended himself. If we are much attached to our worldly goods and lose part of them by means of the weather, the thief, or by injustice, how full of grief, complaint, and impatience we are. But if our principal reason for caring for them is that God has given them to us, and not on our own account, their loss will not deprive us of composure or tranquility. Such is the difference in the clothing of men and beasts. For the garments of the latter adhere to their flesh, and those of men can be put on or laid aside as they will. From August of 2020 to August of 2021, my family was stationed in Turkey. It was, to date, my favorite assignment. I loved it all. The people, the food, the sights. Didn't love the earthquake, but the rest I loved. In Turkey, the dollar was so strong that we lived like kings, and pretty much any American would live like a king in Turkey. I would go to the money exchange place and bring in some US cash and come out with like a Scrooge McDuck money bag just stuffed with lira. It was crazy. Now, this was all during COVID, and COVID damaged a lot of economies around the world, but it really devastated Turkey's economy. Consequently, people were desperate for money. My husband and I didn't want to just give out money and treat people like charity cases, so instead, we decided to use our money to support their businesses. That way, they could provide us with something wonderful and they could maintain their dignity. For example, there was a shoe shiner named Jimmy who sat outside the building where my husband worked. Every week, I brought my husband's dress shoes to him to clean up and shine. It was so cheap that it was like spending $1 for us, but it was enough to give him something to buy food with. We bought lots of unique Turkish things, and each month we'd pick a family member or a friend from back home and send them a goodie box from Turkey. We made sure to eat at their restaurants. An amazing 5-course meal in Turkey was cheaper there than eating at Chick-fil-A in the States. There was this one restaurant that was particularly hit hard during COVID, and I would order lunch from them just to help them out. And they would walk the food over on this big tray to my apartment, come into my apartment, lay it all out on the table, and even bring extra food for us to try. It was amazing. They made the best beats in the world. I know that sounds crazy, but they really were just the best. And they were so happy to serve us and so happy to have business. My family loved to go to the poor vendors and buy their chestnuts or their flowers, their pigeon feed, and their tea. We couldn't speak well with them, but we enjoyed going to be with them and learn from them. St. Francis says, quote, "If you love the poor, go frequently among them, take pleasure in bringing them around you and in visiting and conversing willingly with the poor, and mingle with them in the church, the street, and elsewhere. Be poor in speech towards them, speaking with them as your friend, but let your hands be rich, imparting to them freely of your abundance." Unquote. It wasn't as if my husband and I were just walking around buying things just to have stuff there. And I'm not saying this to brag. This was a very unique time in our lives. But we did recognize that our wealth in Turkey could bless other people. And so we were really happy to use their services, eat at their restaurants, shop in their little shops or their street side carts in order to help them. And in return, they blessed us with their smiles and friendship. We came to know many of them, and oftentimes they were so generous back to us. It made living there truly special. It's one of the things I miss so much. I miss walking the streets and seeing them and waving to say, "Merhaba." I think the point that St. Francis is making here is that if you are wealthy, don't let it go to your head and your heart. Be generous with your wealth. Don't hoard it up. Give it to the poor and find ways to help them maintain their dignity. Be kind to them. Treat them as friends and equals. And, if it's safe and prudent, form a relationship with them. When we got back to the States, we couldn't live like kings anymore, especially in the DC area. But I will always be grateful that I had such an intimate chance to see how rightly using your money to help those in need can be such a beautiful act of charity. It truly is a blessing to bless others. That is all for today, Catholic Pilgrims. I look forward to our next meeting together, and until then, live the faith boldly and travel well.